There are some places that seem to resist the truth. Not because the answers have disappeared, but because someone, somewhere, spent years making sure they would never surface. If you've ever traveled through the low country of South Carolina on a still afternoon, you might understand the feeling. The sunlight filters through the sprawling branches of ancient live oaks in such a way that the entire world feels suspended, like a painting frozen in time. The beauty there is overwhelming, almost too perfect to be real. But beneath that beauty, if you pay close attention, there's something heavier, something buried deep, a quiet density in the land itself, as though the soil has absorbed more history than it was ever meant to carry. Along one forgotten stretch of that land on property that no longer appears on any modern map there once stood a plantation. It wasn't famous. It wasn't the richest or the largest. By the standards of the time, there was nothing especially remarkable about it. The house was elegant but modest. The fields were fertile but not extraordinary. The man who managed it was known for being practical, disciplined, and careful not to draw attention to himself. And yet, there was one thing about that plantation that no one could ignore. One of the cabins was never left alone. Not during harvest season, when every worker was needed in the fields. Not during the bitter stillness of winter, when there was nothing to guard and no reason to stand watch in the cold. Not during the chaos of war, when everything else was unraveling. Not even during the devastating floods of 1852. When the land itself seemed to be slipping away. Day or night, storm or drought, calm or crisis, there was always someone standing outside that door. Over the years, everything else changed. Overseers came and went. Seasons turned. Even ownership of the land shifted more than once. But the watch never ended. The cabin is set slightly apart from the others near the tree line, with its crooked door and dim oilcloth window, was never left unguarded. For nearly 4 decades, not a single night passed without someone posted there. No one who lived or worked on that land was ever told why, and those who dared to ask quickly learned not to ask again. This is not a ghost story. It isn't folklore or a tale meant to frighten children. It's something far more unsettling. It's a story about what people are capable of when they believe no one will ever find out who, and what happens when, after years of silence, someone finally does. To understand what happened at this place, you have to understand the world it belonged to. Not in broad historical terms, but in the quiet, everyday realities of life in the South Carolina Low Country between 1820 and 1860. Because that world, its rules, its silences, its careful concealments didn't just allow a secret like this to exist. It made it inevitable. In the 1820s, South Carolina was a land of striking contradictions. The scenery was breathtaking, wide rivers reflecting the morning sky, towering oaks forming green tunnels over winding roads, endless cotton fields stretching like a pale ocean across the horizon. The air in summer was thick with heat, earth, and the sweet scent of growing things. It was easy, if you weren't looking closely, to mistake that beauty for goodness. But the two were not the same. By 1825, enslaved people outnumbered free white citizens in the state. Every aspect of its prosperity, its homes, its politics, its wealth rested entirely on forced labor. This wasn't hidden. It wasn't questioned in polite society. Among the planter class, it was simply accepted as the natural order. Justified, defended, protected. The plantation system wasn't just economic, it was a complete structure of control. It dictated movement, speech, behavior, and even thought. It defined what could be known and what must remain hidden, because certain truths, if exposed, had the power to collapse everything. This was the world in which that plantation existed, and it was the world that allowed its secret to endure for nearly 40 years. The land itself covered around 1,400 acres, located roughly 30 miles inland from Charleston. It had been owned by the same family since the late 18th century, when it was transformed from a failing rice operation into a successful cotton plantation. The original owner was known as a hard, practical man, and not openly cruel, but capable of viewing people as assets rather than human beings. When he died, the estate passed to his son, who would oversee it for decades. On the surface, The son appeared unremarkable. He was disciplined, organized, and respected among his peers. He attended church, managed his land carefully, and avoided the reckless behaviors that ruined others in his position. He lived a life expected of him and did so without drawing suspicion. Except for one detail, he kept a guard stationed outside one particular cabin. At first, it was subtle, easy to overlook. A man standing near the edge of the cabins, leaning against the wall, perhaps smoking or watching the fields. It didn't seem unusual until you noticed that he was always there. Return the next day, and he hadn't moved far. Return again and he was still there, watching, waiting, guarding something no one was meant to understand. And the day after that and the night after that. The cabin in question was the last one in the row, set slightly apart from the others, closer to the tree that marked the western boundary of the plantation's cleared land. It was built the same as all the others, rough-hewn pine boards, a single window covered with oilcloth, a door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. From the outside, there was nothing to distinguish it from any of the other cabins. No markings, no visible lock, no sign of anything unusual, just a door and a man standing in front of it. The enslaved people who lived and worked at Heron's Bluff knew better than to ask about it. They had learned in the way that people learn things in places where asking the wrong question can cost you everything. That the cabin at the end of the row was not something to be curious about. Children who wandered too close were pulled back by their mothers without explanation, without drama, with the swift and practiced efficiency of people who have learned that the most dangerous thing a child can do is notice the wrong thing. Men who glanced at the cabin too long while walking to the fields found themselves reassigned to the worst tasks the following morning. The ditch digging, the swamp clearing, the work that broke bodies faster than any other. The message was never spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. The message was in the reassignment, in the silence, in the way that Harland Vance's eyes moved over the plantation each morning like a man taking inventory of everything that was his. The white overseers who worked at Heron's Bluff were told when they were hired that the cabin was used for storage of sensitive materials, medicines perhaps, records, valuable equipment that needed to be kept secure. They were told that Mr. Vance kept a man there as a precaution against theft, which was a common enough concern on a working plantation. Most of them accepted this explanation without question. A few did not. A few noticed things that didn't quite add up, heard sounds that didn't quite fit the explanation. But they had learned, too, that at Heron's Bluff there were questions that Mr. Vance did not answer, and Mr. Vance was the one who signed their wages. For nearly 2 decades, this arrangement continued without incident. The guard changed. Sometimes it was a white overseer. Sometimes a trusted enslaved man who had been given a small measure of authority in exchange for his absolute compliance. But the post was never empty. Not once. Not for a single night. And then in the spring of 1843, a man named Thomas Aldridge arrived at Heron's Bluff, and everything began slowly and then all at once to unravel. Thomas Aldridge came to Heron's Bluff as a new overseer hired after the previous man, a Mr. Fenton, who had worked the plantation for 6 years, had left suddenly and without explanation in February of 1843. Fenton had given no notice. He had simply packed his belongings one morning, collected what wages were owed to him, and left. He did not say where he was going. He did not say why he was leaving. He did not in the years that followed maintain any correspondence with anyone at Heron Bluff or in the surrounding county. He disappeared from the record as completely as if he had never existed. Aldridge was 31 years old, originally from the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and had spent the previous 6 years working on tobacco plantations in the Piedmont region before moving south in search of better wages and what he described in his letters as a change of scenery. He was a practical man. He said this of himself often enough that it is worth noting because practical men in his experience did not ask questions that didn't have practical answers. He had no particular feelings about the institution of slavery one way or another, which was in the antebellum South a perfectly ordinary position for a man of his class and occupation. He was there to do a job. The job was to manage the labor of the plantation's enslaved workers, ensure the crop was planted and harvested on schedule, maintain the equipment, and keep the accounts. Everything else was not his concern. He arrived at Heron's Bluff on a Tuesday morning in late March, when the air still carried the last cool edge of winter, and the cotton fields lay bare and brown, waiting for the season. Harlan Vance met him at the main house, a two-story structure of white painted wood with a wide veranda running along the front, handsome, but not ostentatious. The house of a man who was comfortable but not showy. Vance showed him around the property with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The fields, the gin house, the barn, the tool sheds, the overseer's quarters where Aldridge would live. He explained the work schedule, the quotas, the rules. He introduced him to the other overseer, a man named Garrett, who had been at Heron's Bluff for 3 years, and who had the particular quality of stillness that Aldridge had learned to associate with men who had seen things they had decided not to think about. It was a thorough orientation, thorough in almost every respect. When they reached the far end of the slave quarters, a row of 8 cabins arranged in a line, each one identical to the others, except for the small variations that the people living in them had introduced over the years, a flower box here, a carved piece of wood above a door there. Aldridge noticed the man standing near the last cabin. He was a heavy-set enslaved man named Cato, perhaps 40 years old, with arms crossed and eyes fixed on the middle distance with the particular quality of attention that suggested he was not resting but working. Standing there was his work. Aldridge asked the natural question, "What's being kept in there?" Harlan Vance did not break stride. He did not look at the cabin. He did not look at Cato. He said simply and without any particular emphasis, "That's not your concern, Mr. Aldridge. Your concern is the fields and the people who work them. That cabin is mine." Aldridge noted the response in his letter that evening. He wrote, "He said it the way a man says something he has said many times before, not angry, not nervous, not defensive, just final, like a door closing on a room you were not invited into." He let it go. He had a job to do, and the job had nothing to do with whatever was in that cabin. He threw himself into the work of the spring planting, the preparation of the fields, the distribution of seed, the management of the labor gangs, the endless logistical complexity of running a 400-acre cotton operation. He learned the rhythms of the plantation, got to know the other overseer, began to understand the particular personalities and capabilities of the enslaved workers under his supervision. He was, by all accounts, competent and not unnecessarily cruel, a distinction that mattered more than it should have in that time and place, but that mattered nonetheless. But the cabin stayed in the back of his mind. It was not just the guard that bothered him, though the guard was strange enough. It was the sounds. He heard them for the first time about 3 weeks after his arrival on a warm April night when he was walking back to the overseer's quarters after a late check of the livestock. The night was clear and still, the kind of night when sound carries farther than it should, when the ordinary noises of a sleeping plantation, the creak of wood settling, the distant call of a night bird, the movement of animals in the barn seemed amplified and strange. He was passing the far end of the slave row when he heard it, a sound from inside the last cabin. Not a cry, not a voice, not anything that he could immediately identify and file away under a familiar category. Something lower than any of those things and more rhythmic. A sound like someone rocking. The slow repetitive creak of weight shifting back and forth in a very small space, regular as a clock, patient as water. He stopped walking. The man on guard that night, a different man from Cato, younger, with a face that gave nothing away, looked at him without expression, not alarm, not curiosity, just the flat practiced blankness of someone who has been told many times and in many ways that their job is to stand here and notice nothing. Aldridge said nothing. He walked on, but he heard it again the following week and the week after that. Always at night, always the same rhythm, that slow, repetitive movement, like something wearing a groove into the floor of a space too small to pace in, too confining to do anything in except rock. Back and forth, back and forth. The sound of a creature that has found the only motion available to it and repeated it until the motion became the creature. He began to pay closer attention to the guard rotation. He noticed that the men assigned to watch the cabin were never the same 2 nights in a row, a deliberate policy, he eventually concluded, designed to prevent any single person from accumulating too much knowledge of what the post entailed. He noticed that they were always among the most trusted workers on the plantation, men who had demonstrated over years of careful observation by Harlan Vance an absolute capacity for silence. He noticed that when the guard changed at dawn, the outgoing man never spoke to the incoming one. They simply exchanged a look that Aldridge, watching from a distance, could not read, but that clearly communicated something. And the first man walked away without glancing back. He noticed, too, that Harlan Vance visited the cabin himself alone approximately once a week, always in the early morning before the rest of the plantation was fully awake. He would go in, stay for perhaps 20 minutes, and come out again. His expression when he emerged was always the same. Not troubled, not relieved, not guilty, not satisfied, simply blank. The face of a man who has done something he considers necessary and has long since stopped permitting himself to feel anything about it. By June of 1843, Thomas Aldridge had been at Heron's Bluff for 3 months, and he had come to a conclusion that he was not entirely comfortable with. Whatever was in that cabin was alive. The history of Heron's Bluff, as Aldridge would eventually piece together through months of careful, patient, and extremely cautious conversation with the people who had lived the longest, was not the history that Harlan Vance presented to the world. The official history was simple and clean. Gerald Vance had built the plantation, Huron had inherited it, and for 30 years it had operated as a prosperous cotton operation. The records were in order. The accounts were balanced. The church attendance was regular. The agricultural board meetings were attended. The neighbors were cordial. Everything was exactly as it should be. The real history was something else entirely. It began, as best as Aldridge could determine, in the winter of 1821. The older workers were not certain of the exact year, only that it was shortly after Harlan Vance had taken full control of the plantation following his father's death. In that first period when a young man who has just inherited power is still deciding what kind of man he is going to be. That winter something had happened that the workers referred to in the careful coded language that enslaved people used to discuss things that could not be discussed openly as the change. Before the change, the last cabin in the row had been occupied like all the others by a family or by several workers who shared the space. After the change, it was emptied. The people who had lived there were moved to other cabins, given no explanation, offered no choice, and then the guard began. The oldest person at Heron's Bluff when Aldridge arrived was a woman named Nance, who was believed to be somewhere between 70 and 80 years old. No one knew exactly because the records of enslaved people's births were kept inconsistently at best and not at all at worst, and who had been at the plantation since before Harlan Vance was born. She was too old to work the fields and spend her days in a rocking chair outside her cabin, shelling beans or mending cloth, or simply sitting in the particular stillness of someone who has outlived most of the things that once required her to move. She watched the world with eyes that had seen more of it than most people ever would. And she had the quality common to very old people who have survived very difficult lives of knowing exactly how much of what she knew she was going to share and with whom and when. Aldridge approached her carefully over several weeks with small gifts, extra food, a piece of cloth, a length of good thread. Nothing that would draw attention. Nothing that could be interpreted as anything other than a small human kindness. He was not the first white man to try to extract information from an old enslaved woman through small kindnesses, and Nance was not the first old enslaved woman to recognize exactly what was happening and decide, for her own reasons, how much to give. What she gave him over the course of several conversations spread across the summer of 1843 was this. In the winter of the year she called the bad winter, the one that had come 2 or 3 years after old Mr. Gerald died, Harlan Vance had brought something to the plantation. Not someone, something. That was the word she used, and she used it deliberately, watching his face as she said it to see how he would react. She was testing him. She was deciding in real time whether he was someone she could afford to tell the truth to. He had brought it at night, she said, in a wagon covered with canvas, arriving after dark when most of the plantation was asleep. 2 men had carried it into the last cabin. 2 men she had never seen before and never saw again. Men who had come from somewhere else and returned to somewhere else before the sun came up. And then the guard had begun. Aldridge asked her what it was. Nance looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was golden and thick, the way it gets in the Carolina low country in late summer, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird was running through its repertoire, with the mechanical persistence of a creature that has no concept of silence. The air smelled of heat and pine resin, and the particular sweetness of the cotton fields at the end of a long day. Then she said, "I only know what I heard, and what I heard was a child." She said it quietly, without drama. The way you say something that has been sitting inside you for 20 years and has long since lost the power to shock you, though it has never lost the power to trouble you. The way you say something that you have turned over in your mind so many times that the edges have worn smooth, but the weight of it has never changed. A child? Aldridge sat with it for a moment. Then he asked the question that seemed most obvious. Whose child? Nance shook her head. That she said she did not know, or perhaps she did know and had decided that this was the piece she would not give him. He could not tell. She was a woman who had survived 80 years in a world designed to destroy her, and she had done it partly by knowing exactly how much to say and when to stop. He thanked her and walked away with more questions than he had arrived with. A child kept in a cabin guarded day and night for 20 years. He turned the facts over in his mind, looking for an explanation that made sense within the world. He understood a child born with some illness or condition that Vance wanted to hide from the community. A child who was somehow dangerous, prone to violence perhaps, or to episodes that frightened the other workers. A child who was the product of some relationship that Vance needed to conceal. A child who was in some way that he could not yet articulate, a threat to something that Harlan Vance valued more than he valued the child. All of these explanations were possible. None of them fully satisfied him because none of them explained the absolute unbroken consistency of the guard. 20 years. Not a single night without someone at the door. Whatever was in that cabin, Harlan Vance was not merely hiding it. He was containing it. He was maintaining it. He was managing it with the same methodical attention that he brought to every other aspect of the plantation's operation. The crop rotations, the equipment maintenance, the careful balancing of the accounts, and he was doing it in a way that suggested he was terrified not of the thing itself, but of what would happen if the world found out it existed. Thomas Aldridge was a practical man, as he had said of himself, and practical men do not generally spend their evenings constructing elaborate theories about the secrets of their employers. But the cabin had gotten under his skin in a way that he could not entirely account for. And by the late summer of 1843, he had begun to do something that he knew even as he did it was dangerous. He had begun to watch, not obviously, not in a way that would draw attention from Harlan Vance or from Garrett, the other overseer, who had the quality of a man who noticed things and reported them. He simply arranged his evening walks to take him past the far end of the slave row more often than strictly necessary. He noted the times of the guard changes, always at dawn, always at dusk, always conducted with that same wordless exchange of looks. He noted which men were assigned to which nights, and began to see the pattern in the rotation. Never the same man 2 nights running. Never a man who had been at the plantation for less than 5 years. Never a man who had shown any tendency toward conversation with the white overseers. He noted the frequency of Harlan Vance's visits, and whether there was any pattern to them, any correlation with events on the plantation, with the seasons, with anything he could identify. What he found after 2 months of careful observation was this: Harlan Vance's visits to the cabin increased whenever there was a significant disruption to the ordinary routine of the plantation, a birth, a death, a visitor from outside, the arrival of a new worker. Any event that altered the normal texture of life at Heron's Bluff seemed to prompt an additional visit, sometimes 2 in a single week. where before there had been only one. This told Aldridge something important. It told him that Vance was not simply checking on a storage room or monitoring a sick animal. He was managing something that was aware of the world outside the cabin. Something that responded to changes in that world, or that Vance feared might respond to them. Something that needed to be in some way that Aldridge could not yet fully articulate, settled, reassured, or warned. In September of 1843, a man named Apprentice Vance arrived at Heron's Bluff. He was Harlan's younger brother, and he had been living in Charleston for the past decade, working in some capacity in the shipping trade. The two brothers were not close. That much was apparent from the stiffness of their greeting when Apprentice arrived, from the particular quality of formality that exists between people who share blood but not warmth, and from the fact that Harlan had not mentioned his brother's impending visit to anyone on the plantation. Apprentice simply appeared one afternoon in a hired carriage with two trunks and an expression that suggested he had not come by choice. He stayed for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, Harlan Vance visited the last cabin every single day, sometimes twice. Aldridge watched this with great interest. On the third day of Apprentice's visit, Aldridge managed to position himself near enough to the main house veranda to overhear a portion of a conversation between the two brothers. He was not proud of this. He noted it in his letters with a certain self-consciousness, acknowledging that it was not the behavior of a gentleman, but he heard it nonetheless, and what he heard changed the nature of his understanding of everything he had been observing. He caught only fragments. Apprentice's voice, lower and more urgent than his brother's, carrying the particular tension of a man who has been rehearsing this conversation for a long time, and is not finding it going the way he rehearsed it. Cannot continue this way, Harlan. It has been 20 years. People will eventually. And then Harlan's voice, flat and final as a stone dropped into still water. No one will know. No one has known. And no one will. A pause, the sound of a chair moving on the wooden boards of the veranda. Then Apprentice again, quieter now, almost pleading. And when you're gone, what then? What happens when you're not here to manage it? And Harlan, without hesitation, without any audible emotion at all. That is not your concern. That has never been your concern. Aldridge walked away before he could hear more. He had heard enough. 20 years. Harlan had said it himself. Whatever was in that cabin had been there for 20 years. And Apprentice Vance, a man who lived 30 miles away in Charleston, and had apparently been carrying the weight of this knowledge for all of those 20 years, was frightened, not of the thing itself, but of what would happen when Harlan was no longer there to contain it. He went back to Nance the following week. He told her what he had heard. He asked her again, not whose child, but what had happened to the child. Was it still alive? Nance looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was different now. September light lower and more golden than August, carrying in it the first suggestion of the coming change. The mockingbird was gone. The air was quieter. Still there? She said finally. Still in that cabin. How do you know? Aldridge asked. She looked at him as if the question were slightly foolish. Because the guard is still she said. The guard stops when what's inside stops. He understood what she meant. The guard was not just a precaution. It was a signal, a living indicator. As long as the guard stood, whatever was inside was still alive. The guard was the only acknowledgement in the entire visible world of Heron's Bluff Plantation that the person in that cabin existed at all, and it had been alive in that cabin for 20 years. If you're still with us, and I think you are, because this is the kind of story that doesn't let you go, I want to ask you something. Before we continue, do you think Harlan Vance believed he was doing the right thing? Or do you think he knew every single morning when he walked to that cabin exactly what he was? Leave your answer in the comments. We read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Because what comes next is the part of this story that changes everything. The winter of 1843 came early to the South Carolina Lowcountry. By November, the fields were stripped and bare, the cotton long since ginned and baled and shipped to Charleston, and the plantation had settled into the slower rhythm of the cold months. Fence mending, tool repair, the endless maintenance that a working farm required to be ready for the following spring. The days were shorter. The nights were long and quiet and cold, the kind of cold that comes off the river and settles into everything, into the wood of the buildings and the ground beneath your feet and the spaces between your thoughts. It was in this quiet that Thomas Aldridge made his mistake. He had been at Heron's Bluff for 8 months by then, and in those 8 months he had accumulated a considerable body of observation and a considerable weight of unresolved questions. He had also, without quite intending to, developed something he could only describe as a compulsion. The cabin was there every day at the edge of his vision. The guard was there, and somewhere inside someone had been living in that space for 20 years in a silence so complete that the only evidence of their existence was the sound of rocking in the dark and the presence of a man standing at a door. He told himself he was going to look, just look, not enter, not interfere, not do anything that could be construed as a violation of his employer's property or authority. Just look through the window. The cabin was not empty. In the far corner, on a low pallet covered with a rough blanket, there was a figure, a person sitting upright, knees drawn to chest, arms wrapped around the knees in the posture of someone who has learned that making themselves as small as possible is the safest way to exist in a space. The figure was rocking. That slow rhythmic motion that Aldridge had heard on so many nights, back and forth, back and forth. The motion of someone for whom movement has become the only available response to the fact of being alive. He could not see the face clearly. The figure was turned slightly away from him toward the wall, toward the darkness in the corner that the candle's light could not reach, but he could see enough to understand several things at once. Things that hit him not in sequence, but all together, like a hand pressed flat against his chest. The figure was an adult or something close to it. The proportions were those of a grown person, not a child. The shoulders were broad. The legs folded against the chest were long. But the posture, the rocking, the way the arms clutched the knees, these were not the postures of an adult. They were the postures of a child who had never been given the space, the experience, the human contact necessary to grow into anything else. The figure was dressed in plain clean clothing, not rags, not the clothing of someone who had been neglected in the physical sense. Someone had been caring for this person, feeding them, clothing them, maintaining them in a state of basic physical adequacy. This was not neglect in the conventional sense. This was something more deliberate and in its own way more disturbing than neglect. This was maintenance, the careful, methodical maintenance of something that needed to be kept alive but did not need to be allowed to live. And then the figure stopped rocking. The stillness was sudden and complete, like a clock stopping. One moment the motion was there, regular and rhythmic, and the next it was simply gone. And in the silence that followed, the figure slowly, very slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has learned that sudden movements bring consequences, turned its head toward the window. Aldridge pulled back before he could see the face. He pressed himself against the wall of the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that seemed impossible to contain. Certain that he had been seen, certain that Reuben would turn around, certain that everything was about to collapse into something he could not control, he stood there for what felt like a very long time, not breathing, not moving, listening. Nothing happened. After several minutes, he could not have said how many, he heard the rocking begin again. Slow, rhythmic, endless. The sound of someone returning to the only motion they knew. He walked back to the overseer's quarters in the dark, and he did not sleep that night. He lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about what he had seen, turning it over and over in his mind, the way you turn a stone over in your hand, when you are not sure what it is, but you are sure that it matters. An adult with the posture of a child kept in a cabin guarded day and night for 20 years. He thought about Nancy's words. The guard stops when what's inside stops. He thought about Apprentice Vance's voice on the ver, carrying that particular quality of a man who has been frightened for a long time and has learned to live with the fear but has never learned to stop feeling it. He thought about Harlan Vance's face when he emerged from his weekly visits. That blank deliberate emptiness, the face of a man who has decided that feeling nothing is the only sustainable response to what he has done. And he thought about the figure in the corner, rocking in the candle light, and the way it had stopped, and turned its head toward the window with the slow and patient attention of something that has been waiting for a very long time, for someone to look. The next morning, He made a decision that would change everything. He wrote a letter not to Harlan Vance, not to anyone in the county, not to anyone whose first instinct upon receiving such a letter would be to protect the man who signed their wages or the system that kept them comfortable. He wrote to a man named Reverend Clement Oakes, who ran a small Methodist congregation in a town called Mill Haven about 20 miles north of Heron's Bluff, and who had a reputation carefully cultivated and carefully guarded in the way that such reputations had to be in South Carolina in 1843 as a man who could be trusted with difficult information. Oakes was not an abolitionist, not openly. Not in South Carolina, where such a position was not merely unpopular but actively dangerous, where men had been run out of towns, had their property destroyed, had been subjected to violence for expressing views that in other parts of the country were merely controversial. But he was known among those who knew such things as a man who believed that certain things were wrong, regardless of what the law said about them. A man who had on more than one occasion found ways to do things that the law did not sanction without ever quite doing anything that the law could prosecute. Aldrich did not tell Oakes everything in the letter. He told him enough. He described the cabin, the guard, the figure he had seen through the window. He described what Nance had told him. He described the conversation he had overheard between the Vance brothers. He described the pattern of Harlan Vance's visits and what that pattern suggested about the nature of what was being kept inside. He sealed the letter carefully with wax and gave it to a traveling merchant who passed through the plantation in early December, asking him to deliver it to Oakes's church in Mill Haven. He gave the merchant a small amount of money, enough to ensure the delivery, not enough to make it memorable. Then he waited. He waited through December and into January. He continued his work. He continued his observations. He noticed in those weeks that Harlan Vance seemed slightly more watchful than usual, his eyes moving over the plantation each morning with a quality of attention that was subtly different from his ordinary survey, as if he were looking not for problems in the operation of the plantation, but for something else. Something that might be out of place, something that might have shifted. Aldrich was careful to give him nothing. In late January of 1844, Reverend Oakes arrived at Heron's Bluff. He came under the pretext of a pastoral visit. He was known to make occasional rounds of the plantations in the area, offering religious services to the enslaved workers, which was a practice that most planters tolerated as a useful tool for maintaining order and compliance. Harlan Vance received him politely, offered him dinner, and gave him permission to hold a brief service in the slave quarters the following morning. It was a perfectly ordinary visit, of the kind that happened at plantations across the county several times a year. Aldrich managed to speak with Oakes for approximately 4 minutes in a corner of the barn while the horses were being watered and Garrett was occupied on the other side of the property. 4 minutes was not long, but Oakes was a man who had learned to communicate a great deal in a very short time. He had done some investigation of his own in the weeks since receiving Aldrich's letter. He had spoken carefully and indirectly to people who had connections to Heron's Bluff, former workers who had been sold or hired out to other plantations, merchants who traded regularly with the Vance operation, a physician in Charleston who had been called out to the property on several occasions over the years. What he had found was fragmentary and incomplete, assembled from pieces that no single person had been willing to provide in their entirety. But the pieces, when you put them together, pointed in a direction that made Aldrich's blood run cold. There had been a child born at Heron's Bluff in the winter of 1821. The child had been born to an enslaved woman named Delia, who had died shortly after the birth. Of complications, the record said, though the record was sparse, and the details were vague in the way that records of enslaved people's deaths tended to be vague, as if the specifics were not considered worth preserving. The child had survived, and the child's father, according to the whispers that Oakes had collected from people who had been at the plantation in those years, and had since moved on, was Harlan Vance himself. This was not, in the antebellum South, an unusual situation. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women by their enslavers was so common as to be almost unremarkable, and the children produced by such relationships occupied a deeply uncomfortable position in the social order. Legally enslaved like their mothers, but carrying the blood of the white planter class in a society that was built on the absolute non-negotiable separation of those two categories. Such children existed everywhere in the South. They were sold, hired out, sent away, ignored, occasionally acknowledged in private while being denied in public. The system had 100 ways of managing them, all of them designed to make the inconvenient truth of their existence disappear into the machinery of the institution. What was unusual, what was in fact extraordinary, was what Harlan Vance had done next. The child, according to Oakes's information, had been born with a physical appearance that made it impossible to conceal what it was, or rather who its father was. The resemblance, by all accounts, was unmistakable. Not the kind of resemblance that could be explained away or politely ignored. The kind of resemblance that, in a world built on the pretense that certain things did not happen, was simply intolerable. And so Harlan Vance had made a decision. He had not sold the child. He had not sent it away to another state, another county, another plantation, where no one would know its history. He had not done any of the things that planters in his position typically did to resolve such inconveniences. Instead, he had put the child in a cabin and posted a guard and kept it there, hidden from the world for 20 years. Why? Oakes had a theory, and it was a theory that Aldridge found when he heard it, both entirely plausible and deeply disturbing in its very plausibility, in the way that it required no monsters, no extraordinary evil, only the ordinary calculations of a man protecting what he valued most. Elena Vance, Harlan's wife, came from a family that was, by the standards of the South Carolina planter class, considerably more prominent than the Vances. Her father had been a state legislator. Her brother was a judge in Beaufort County. The Pratt family's social standing was, in the careful arithmetic of that world, a significant asset to Harlan Vance. One that had opened doors, smoothed transactions, and provided a layer of social protection that a man of his moderate origins could not have achieved on his own. It was an asset he could not afford to lose. And Elena Vance was by all accounts not a woman who would have tolerated the existence of such a child, not the existence of it, not the knowledge of it, not the possibility that anyone might see it and draw the obvious conclusion about what it meant and who was responsible for it. Elena Vance was a woman of her class and her time, which meant that she had been trained from childhood to maintain a particular fiction about the world she lived in, a fiction that required above all else that certain things not be seen. So Harlan Vance had hidden it, not to protect the child, not out of any feeling for the child at all, to protect himself, to protect his marriage, his social standing, his position in the community, his relationship with the Pratt family, his seat on the agricultural board, his pew in the Episcopal Church. The child was not a person to be cared for. It was a problem to be managed, and for 20 years he had managed it with the same methodical efficiency that he brought to everything else. The guard was not there to protect the child from the world. It was there to protect the world from knowing the child existed. The spring of 1844 came to Heron's Bluff with a warmth that felt to Thomas Aldridge almost indecent. The ilex blooming in extravagant pink and white along the main drive, the fields greening up with the first shoots of the new cotton crop, the air carrying that particular sweetness of things growing in rich soil after a cold winter. It was the kind of spring that made you believe, if you were not paying attention, that the world was a fundamentally decent place, that things grew and bloomed and renewed themselves, and that this was the essential truth of existence. Aldridge was paying attention. He and Reverend Oakes had spent the intervening months in careful, clandestine correspondence, letters that were written in language deliberately vague enough to be innocuous if intercepted, but clear enough between two men who understood what they were discussing. Oakes had made contact with several people in Charleston, a lawyer named Harrove who had a reputation for taking cases that other lawyers declined, a physician named Dry Vansel Webb, who had trained in Philadelphia and had views about human dignity that were not entirely compatible with the world he had chosen to practice in, and a woman whose name Aldridge was never told, but who was described to him as someone with connections to networks that moved people and information across the South in ways that the law did not sanction and the authorities did not officially acknowledge. Together, over those winter months, They had constructed a plan. The plan was not dramatic. It was not a rescue in the conventional sense. There was no possibility of simply removing the person from the cabin without consequences that would fall most heavily on the enslaved people at Heron Bluff who had nothing to do with any of it. The law was clear and the law was enforced and the law was not on their side. What Oakes and his associates had determined after considerable deliberation was that the most effective course of action available to them within the constraints of that time and place and legal system was documentation. If the existence of this person could be established in writing, if there were witnesses, records, testimony from credible parties, then the secret that Harlan Vance had maintained for 20 years would become something that could not simply be made to disappear. It would exist in the world in a form that the world could not ignore. It would be a fact. And facts, even in a world designed to suppress them, have a way of persisting. This was Aldrich understood a limited and imperfect solution. It would not undo 20 years. It would not restore what had been taken. It would not give back the childhood, the language, the human contact, the simple experience of existing in the world as a person rather than a secret. But it was what was possible. And possible in that time and place was not nothing. In April of 1844, Reverend Oakes arrived at Heron's Bluff for a second pastoral visit. He brought with him as part of his traveling party, a man he introduced as his assistant, a quiet, unremarkable-looking man named Webb, who was, in fact, the physician from Charleston. The visit was arranged to coincide with a day when Harlan Vance was away from the plantation. He had traveled to Charleston for a meeting of the County Agricultural Board, a trip that Aldrich had known all about for 2 weeks and had communicated to Oakes in advance. Ellen Vance was at home, but she was occupied with a visit from her sister, a woman from Beaufort, who came twice a year, and whose visits consumed Ilalina's attention entirely. The other overseer, Garrett, was occupied with a fence repair on the far side of the property that Aldrich had arranged to keep him busy for the better part of the day. Everything was in place. Aldrich led Oakes and Webb to the far end of the slave quarters in the mid-morning when the light was clear and the air was warm, and the rest of the plantation was occupied with its ordinary work. The guard that day was Cato, the same man who had been standing there on Aldrich's first day at the plantation more than a year earlier. Cato looked at the 3 men approaching and said nothing. His face was unreadable. His arms were crossed. He stood in front of the door the way he had stood in front of it every day for years, with the patience of someone who has made his peace with his assignment. Aldrich stopped in front of him. He looked at Cato directly, not over his shoulder, not at the cabin, but at Cato's face. And he spoke to him as one man speaks to another, which was not the ordinary mode of address between an overseer and an enslaved man at a plantation in South Carolina in 1844, and which Carter registered with a slight shift of his eyes. That might have been surprise. Aldrich told him what he knew. He told him what he and Oakes were trying to do. He told him that no one at the plantation would be harmed by what happened next. That the purpose of this visit was not to take anything or destroy anything or expose anyone who did not deserve to be exposed. He told him that if Cato chose not to step aside, they would leave and he would understand and there would be no consequences. Cato stood very still for a long moment. The morning light came through the live oaks at the edge of the tree and made patterns on the ground between them. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker was working at a dead pine with methodical persistence. Then Cato stepped to one side. The door of the cabin was not locked. It opened inward on those slightly crooked hinges with a sound like a long exhalation. The sound of something that has been held closed for a very long time finally being allowed to open. The interior was dim. The oilcloth over the window admitted only a thin gray light, and the air inside was close and warm, carrying the smell of tallow and wood smoke and something else, something harder to name. The particular smell of a space that has been lived in for a very long time by someone who has had nowhere else to go. The smell of a life contained in the corner on the pallet. The figure sat. The rocking had stopped. The figure was looking at the door with the expression of someone who has heard the sound of that door opening many times before and has learned to wait very still to see what the opening means. Webb stepped forward. He spoke quietly in a tone that Aldrich would later describe in his letters as the most careful and deliberate he had ever heard from another human being. Each word placed with the precision of someone who understands that the wrong word in this moment could shatter something that cannot be put back together. He spoke slowly. He kept his hands visible. He did not move quickly. He did not raise his voice. What Webb found and what he documented in a written account that he sealed and deposited with the lawyer in Charleston that same evening was this: the person in the cabin was a young man. He was approximately 22 or 23 years old based on Webb's medical assessment of his physical development. He was in reasonable physical health. He had been fed, clothed, and kept warm in the minimal sense that those words implied. He had not been subjected to the kind of physical deprivation that leaves visible marks on a body. Someone had maintained him in the way that you maintain something you cannot afford to lose but do not know what to do with. He had received no education. He could not read. He could not write. He had had no sustained human contact beyond the weekly visits of Harlan Vance. Visits that Webb, based on Aldrich's descriptions, concluded were not visits of any warmth or human connection, but rather inspections. The kind of check that a man makes on something he is responsible for keeping alive, and the silent presence of the guards outside his door. He had spent his entire conscious life from earliest memory in that cabin. He did not speak, not because he was unable to. Webb determined through careful examination that there was no physical impediment to speech. He did not speak because he had had no one to speak to. He had had no language modeled for him in any sustained way, no conversation, no human exchange of any kind beyond the most basic and functional. He communicated in sounds and gestures in the way that a person communicates when language has never been given to them as a tool. When the words that other people use to navigate the world have never been made available. He was in the most precise and devastating sense of the phrase a person who had been kept from becoming a person. Webb also documented what Oakes had suspected and what Aldrich had begun to understand. The young man's physical appearance made the question of his parentage unmistakable. He bore a resemblance to Harlan Vance that was in Webb's clinical language striking and unambiguous. The same jaw, the same set of the eyes, the same particular shape of the brow that appeared in the portrait of Harlan Vance that hung in the main house of Heron's Bluff Plantation. Harlan Vance had looked at his own son 22 years earlier and had decided that the most convenient thing to do with him was to make him disappear, not to kill him. Vance was not apparently capable of that, or perhaps simply unwilling to carry that particular weight, but to erase him, to keep him in a space between existence and non-existence, alive but unknown, present but invisible, breathing and eating and rocking in the dark. A secret so well kept that even the people who guarded him had been trained over years not to think of him as a person. The document that Webb prepared that afternoon was 8 pages long. It described the young man's physical condition, his approximate age, his apparent cognitive and developmental state, and the circumstances of his confinement. It named Harlan Vance as the person responsible for that confinement. It was signed by Webb, witnessed by Oakes, and countersigned by Thomas Aldrich. Cato, who had watched the entire examination from the doorway with the stillness of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time, and is not entirely sure how to feel now that it has arrived, was asked if he would add his mark to the document. He looked at it for a long time. Then he made his mark. A single line crossed by another pressed into the paper with a deliberateness that suggested he understood exactly what he was doing and had decided after a lifetime of being required to understand nothing that this was worth understanding. What happened next did not happen quickly, and it did not happen cleanly, because nothing in that world happened quickly or cleanly when it involved the exposure of a powerful man's secrets. The machinery of concealment that Harlan Vance had built over 20 years did not dismantle itself overnight. It came apart slowly, piece by piece, in the way that things built on a false foundation eventually come apart, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a gradual, inexorable settling. The document that Webb had deposited with the Charleston lawyer was not in the legal framework of 1844 South Carolina a weapon with obvious or immediate effect. The young man in the cabin was, by law, considered property. However disturbing his confinement may have been, it was not something the courts of South Carolina were willing or designed either to challenge. The legal system was never meant to protect someone like him. It existed to protect men like Harlan Vance. That reality had been reinforced time and again by those who shaped and upheld the law. But Reverend Oakes was not a man who relied solely on the law. Patient and deliberate, he understood that influence could travel through quieter channels. Carefully, and with great discretion, he began sharing pieces of the document, never openly, never in a way that could be traced back to him, Aldrich, or Webb. Instead, he allowed the information to move the way whispers often do, through conversations, letters, and subtle exchanges among people whose opinions carried weight in Vance's world. By the summer of 1844, the truth, though incomplete, had begun to circulate in Charleston. No one knew everything. The document itself remained hidden. Names were not spoken, but enough was known to create unease. Invitations to the Vance household grew fewer. Conversations became strained. Social circles began to shift. That July, Ilalena Vance's brother, a judge from Beaufort County, paid a visit to Heron's Bluff. He stayed for 3 hours. He did not stay for dinner. When he left, Harlan Vance appeared shaken in a way Aldrich had never witnessed before. The judge never returned. In August of 1844, Thomas Aldrich departed Heron's Bluff. He offered a proper explanation, a desire to return to Virginia, and Vance accepted it without objection. They shook hands at the door of the main house on a warm morning, the sounds of plantation life echoing around them. Vance looked at him in a way Aldrich could not fully interpret. It was not anger, not accusation, something more complex perhaps. In another life, it might have been the beginning of shame. In his final letter, Aldrich wrote, "He knows. I do not know how or how much, but he knows that something has changed." The secret remained unspoken in any official sense. It appeared in no newspaper, entered no courtroom, yet it was no longer entirely his. And Vance, in some quiet, reluctant way, seemed to understand that he would never fully contain it again. What became of the young man in the cabin is the most difficult part of the story. The records are silent, and that silence speaks volumes. It reflects how easily a life could be erased when those in power chose to erase it. What is known is this: in the fall of 1845, the guard at the final cabin was removed. After nearly 25 years, the watch simply ended. The cabin stood empty for months, its door slightly ajar, the oilcloth window stirring in the breeze. Eventually, it was repurposed for storage, just as Vance had always claimed. What happened in the time between remains unknown. Whether the young man was moved, freed, or did not survive, no record confirms it. The document prepared by Webb still exists. The lawyer in Charleston who received it is recorded, but the young man himself disappears entirely, as though he had never existed at all. Exactly as Vance had intended. In the years that followed, Vance's standing in the community slowly declined. Invitations dwindled. Relationships weakened. Even his own family kept a noticeable distance. He withdrew from public life, becoming quieter, more isolated. He died in 1857 at the age of 65. The plantation passed to his son, who sold it within 2 years. Over time, the land changed hands repeatedly. By the Civil War, much of it had fallen into neglect. Fields returned to wilderness. Buildings decayed. The last cabin, the one that had once been guarded, burned down in the 1870s. No one recorded how or why. By then, there was no one left who remembered. Or perhaps they chose not to remember. Reverend Oakes continued his work until his death in 1861. Just months after the first shots of the Civil War. Among his belongings was a sealed envelope containing a copy of Webb's document, labeled simply for the recorder should anyone ever wish to know. Aldrich returned to Virginia and lived out his days in quiet obscurity. He never spoke publicly of what he had seen. His letters, which form the foundation of this account, were discovered decades later and stored in a small historical archive, largely untouched. Cato, who once stood guard at the cabin door, was freed in 1863. He appears one final time in a Freedmen's Bureau record in 1865. After that, he too disappears from history. And the young man the one who spent his entire life within a space no larger than 12 by 14 feet left no trace at all. He had never spoken, never walked freely, never seen the world beyond that room. He had been hidden so completely that even his name, if he ever had one, was lost. In the end, what is most disturbing is not only what was done, but how easily it was done. How ordinary the silence was. How many people heard something, suspected something, and chose not to ask. The plantation is gone now. The cabin is gone. The land has reclaimed itself. But somewhere, in a forgotten archive, there are letters. And in those letters, there is a memento, a glimpse through a torn window of a figure rocking in the dim light, repeating the only motion left to him. That small, trembling detail is all that remains. A single mark on a page, a crossed line made by a man named Cato. Proof that they were there. Proof that he was there. And perhaps that is why stories like this are told, not to shock or frighten, but to remember what someone once worked very hard to erase.